The bull looked like he was wearing a second skin made of ticks. That's the image that stayed with every person in the sale barn at the Beeville Livestock Auction in B County, South Texas, on a Thursday morning in June. Lot 23, a 4-year-old Beefmaster bull. Red-brown, heavy-boned, the breed built for heat and humidity and the brutal conditions of the South Texas brush country. 1,400 pounds of animal that should have been worth $3,000 to $4,000 at market. Should have been, except for the ticks. They were everywhere, clustered behind his ears in gray-brown masses the size of a man's thumb, packed into the folds of his dewlap where the skin bunched against his brisket, running in lines along his belly where the hide was thinnest and the blood was closest. His tailhead was a carpet of them, hundreds layered on top of each other in the warm crevice where his tail met his body. The auctioneer read the catalog note without enthusiasm. Consignor reports heavy external parasite load. Selling as is. No guarantees on health status. Buyer assumes all risk. The room did what rooms do when a parasitized animal walks through a ring. Men leaned back from the rail. 2 buyers in the front row stood up and walked to the coffee table. A seedstock producer from Jim Wells County named Blake Hadley shook his head and said to the man beside him, "That bull is a liability on 4 legs. Whoever buys him is bringing 10,000 ticks home to their herd." Blake wasn't wrong about the number. A heavily infested bovine can carry between 5,000 and 20,000 cattle ticks at peak load. Each female tick consumes 3 to 5 milliliters of blood before dropping off to lay eggs. At 20,000 ticks, the daily blood loss exceeds the animal's ability to regenerate red blood cells. Anemia, weight loss, immune suppression, reduced fertility, and the diseases the ticks carry, anaplasmosis, babesiosis, can kill. Opening bid, 2,000. Silence, 1,500. Silence, 1,000. 1 hand. The hand belonged to Emilio Garza, 61 years old. He ran 80 Beefmaster cows on 400 acres of mesquite and huisache brush outside of Pettis in B County, the same ground his grandfather Augustin had run cattle on since 1948. Emilio had been at this sale barn since he was 9 years old, sitting beside Augustin while the old man bought and sold animals with the specific patience of a man who understood that the value of cattle is not always visible to the eye that hasn't learned to look past the surface. Emilio paid $1,000 for a 4-year-old Beefmaster that the room valued at $0. Blake Hadley found him in the parking lot. "Emilio, you know those ticks are going to spread to your entire herd. 1 bull brings them in, and within 60 days, every cow you own is carrying a load. Your pour-on and spray bills alone are going to cost more than that bull is worth." Emilio was tying the trailer gate. He looked at Blake the way his grandfather used to look at men who gave advice that came from the chemical company catalog instead of from the ground. "Blake, my grandfather ran cattle on this ground for 30 years before pour-on existed. Before spray existed. Before any of us spent $1,500 a year on chemical tick control. And his cattle survived. How?" Emilio smiled. The kind of smile that men produce when they know something that the person asking the question isn't ready to hear. You'll see. He drove home, unloaded the bull into a holding pen near the house. The bull stood in the shade of a mesquite tree, and the ticks were visible from 20 feet, gray-brown clusters on every soft surface of his body. A walking colony. His wife Linda came to the fence, looked at the bull, looked at the ticks, looked at Emilio. "Don't tell me what you paid." $1,000. Linda closed her eyes. The expression of a woman who has been married to a man for 38 years and has learned that some of his decisions only make sense after enough time has passed to prove them right. "Emilio, what are you going to do about those ticks?" "Nothing. Nothing? Nothing. We're going to wait." "For what?" Emilio looked at the sky. The big, blue, empty South Texas sky that stretches from the Gulf to the horizon without interruption. The sky that his grandfather Augustin used to watch every morning from the same porch where Emilio now drank his coffee. For the birds. Linda went inside. The screen door closed with the sound of a woman who has heard her husband say something she doesn't understand and has decided to wait for the explanation rather than ask for it. "Now I need to tell you about Augustin Garza." Because this story lives in what Augustine knew and what 2 generations of chemical agriculture made everyone forget. Augustine came to B County from Tamaulipas in 1946. He worked as a ranch hand for 2 years, saved enough to lease 40 acres, bought his first cattle in 48, built the operation to 400 acres over 30 years through work and patience and the specific understanding of South Texas ecology that comes from growing up in a landscape where the plants and animals and insects have been negotiating with each other for 10,000 years without human intervention. Augustine had a saying that Emilio heard so many times growing up that it was embedded in his memory like a brand on hide. The land has a doctor for every disease. You just have to let the doctor show up. The doctor Augustine was talking about was not a veterinarian. It was a bird, the crested caracara, Caracara plancus, a large striking bird of prey that lives year-round in South Texas, Florida, and throughout Central and South America. Black body, white throat and chest, red-orange facial skin. A flat head that gives it an expression somewhere between a hawk and a vulture. The face of a bird that has opinions and isn't afraid to share them. Caracaras are not typical raptors. They don't hunt from the air like hawks or eagles. They're ground hunters, walkers. They patrol open ground on long legs, eating insects, carrion, small animals, and, critically, external parasites on livestock. The relationship between caracaras and cattle in South Texas is ancient, documented in Spanish colonial records, observed by naturalists in the 19th century, photographed in the 20th. The birds land on cattle, backs, flanks, heads, and pick ticks directly from the hide. They eat the engorged females. They eat the larvae. They consume parasites at a rate that no chemical application can match because the chemical has to be reapplied and the bird comes back every day on its own. Augustine knew this because Augustine watched it happen on his cattle for 30 years. He never used chemical tick control, not once. His cattle carried moderate tick loads that the caracaras managed naturally. The birds nested on the property, in the tops of mesquite trees and on the crossbeams of the old wooden corrals, and they treated the cattle as a food source the same way the cattle treated the grass. A system, not designed by anyone, evolved over thousands of years between birds and bovines and brush country. The ticks fed on the cattle, the caracaras fed on the ticks. The cattle survived because the birds did the work that pour-on chemicals would eventually replace. But the birds did it for free. And they did it every day. And they didn't require a prescription. When the chemical tick treatments arrived in the 60s and 70s, permethrin, amitraz, ivermectin, the ranchers in B County adopted them quickly. The pour-ons worked. The sprays worked. The ticks died. The cattle were clean, but the caracaras left. Not because someone chased them, because the food source disappeared. No ticks on the cattle meant no reason for the birds to land on them. The caracaras shifted to other food sources, roadkill, insects, small prey. They were still in the area, still visible on fence posts and power lines. But they stopped visiting the herds, and the ranchers stopped noticing. Within a generation, nobody remembered the birds on the cattle. The relationship that had existed for centuries was invisible. Erased by a bottle of pour-on that cost $12 and worked for 30 days and had to be reapplied every month from March to November at a cost of approximately $1,200 to $1,800 per year for a herd of 80 cows. Emilio remembered, because Augustine made sure he would. When Emilio was 12, Augustine took him to the south pasture at dawn. They sat on the tailgate of Augustine's truck and watched the cattle graze. Within 20 minutes, 3 caracaras landed on the backs of 3 cows. The birds walked along the spine of each cow, picking, eating, moving with the focused efficiency of workers on a task they'd been doing since before the ranch existed. Augustine pointed. Mira, the doctor is working. Every tick that bird eats is one less tick that drinks your cow's blood. One less egg laid in the grass. One less generation of parasites on your land. He looked at Emilio. The chemical companies will tell you their bottle is the answer, and it works. But the bottle costs money. The bird is free. The bottle has to be reapplied. The bird comes back on his own. The bottle kills the tick on the cow. The bird kills the tick and prevents the next generation. The bottle treats, the bird controls. He paused. When I'm gone, remember the birds. Augustin died in 1993. Emilio was 30. He kept the operation, kept the cattle, and for 20 years, he used the pour-on like everyone else. Because the pour-on worked and it was easier than explaining to his neighbors why he should stop using it and wait for birds. But the cost climbed. $1,200 a year became $1,500. Tick resistance to permethrin developed, documented across South Texas in the 2000s. The pour-on that used to give 30 days of control was giving 20, then 15. The chemical treadmill that agriculture had been running on since the 60s was speeding up, and the farmers were falling behind. Emilio stopped using pour-on in 2022. Cold. Told Linda, told his son David, told nobody else. The first season without chemicals, the tick loads on his cattle increased, predictably. Without the pour-on suppressing the population, the ticks returned to the levels that existed before chemicals, the baseline that Augustin's cattle had carried in the 40s and 50s. Emilio's cattle were uncomfortable, not dying. Uncomfortable. The way cattle in South Texas have always been uncomfortable with ticks, before someone invented a way to make them temporarily comfortable and permanently dependent. And then, at 6 weeks without chemical treatment, the Caracaras came back. Not one or two, a group. 7 birds the first morning. Landing on cattle in the south pasture at dawn, the way Augustine had shown Emilio 49 years earlier. Walking the spines, picking the ticks, eating the engorged females with the efficiency of animals performing a function they'd been performing since before fences existed. Emilio was on the porch with his coffee. He saw the birds land, set down his cup, stood up. Linda came to the door. "What's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong. Look." She looked at the pasture. 7 Caracaras on 7 cows. Picking, eating, working. "Are those Caracaras? They're back." Linda looked at Emilio. The expression of a woman who is watching her husband be proven right by birds and isn't sure whether to be impressed or annoyed that he didn't explain better when she asked. Now, the tick-covered bull. Emilio brought the bull home in June. By July, the Caracara group on his property had grown from 7 to 19. The bull's massive tick load was a buffet. The birds visited him multiple times per day, landing on his back, his neck, his face. The bull stood still while they worked. Not stressed by the birds, relieved. The parasites that had been draining his blood and covering his body were being removed by animals that weighed 2 pounds and worked for free. By August, the bull's tick load had dropped by an estimated 70%. Not from chemicals, from birds. 19 Caracaras consuming thousands of ticks per week across the entire herd. Emilio weighed the bull in September. He'd gained 140 pounds since June. The anemia was resolving. His coat was smoothing. His energy was visibly different. The dull lethargy of a parasitized animal replaced by the alert posture of a bull that was no longer losing 3 to 5 milliliters of blood per tick per day times thousands of ticks. Blake Hadley drove past Emilio's property in October, saw the bull in the pasture, pulled over. He stood at the fence looking at a bull that he'd called a liability 4 months earlier. Clean, filled out, standing beside cows with a posture that said, "Ready to work." Blake looked at the Caracaras sitting on the fence posts around the pasture. 5 of them. Watching the cattle the way employees watch a job site. Alert, proprietary, waiting for the next shift. "Emilio, how'd you clean him up? What pour-on did you use?" Emilio was fixing a gate hinge. He looked at Blake, then at the Caracaras. "I didn't use pour-on. Haven't used it in 2 years. Blake looked at the birds, then at the cattle, then at Emilio. "You're telling me the birds are doing it. The birds are doing what they did before we started paying $1,200 a year for a chemical company to do it worse. My grandfather never used pour-on. His cattle carried moderate loads. The Caracaras managed it. The system worked for 30 years until we replaced it with a bottle and forgot the birds existed." Blake was quiet for a long time. The quiet of a man who spends $1,500 a year on tick control, looking at a man who spends 0 and getting better results. "I've got Caracaras on my place. They sit on the fence posts. I see them every day. Emilio looked at him. They're sitting on the fence posts because your cattle are clean. No ticks means no reason to land on the cows. Stop the pour on and the ticks come back and the birds start working. The system resets itself in about 6 weeks. Blake stared at him. You want me to let my cattle get ticks? On purpose? I want you to let the land do what the land has been doing since before your grandfather's grandfather's grandfather was born. The ticks exist. The birds exist. They have a relationship that's older than ranching. We interrupted it with a chemical and forgot it was there. He paused. My grandfather had a saying. The land has a doctor for every disease. You just have to let the doctor show up. Blake drove home. Didn't stop using pour-on that day. But he stopped using it the following March. Called Emilio in May when the ticks came. Called him again in June when the first Caracara landed on a cow. Emilio answered the second call with one sentence. I told you they'd come. The bull's name is Augustin now. Emilio named him after his grandfather because the bull is the reason the birds came back in numbers large enough to manage the entire herd, and the grandfather is the reason Emilio knew they would. Augustine the bull bred 22 cows his first season, 86% conception. His tick load stays moderate, never zero, because zero would mean no food for the birds. The Caracaras maintain the balance. Enough ticks to feed the birds. Few enough ticks that the cattle thrive. The equilibrium that existed before pour-on and will exist after pour-on if anyone has the patience to let it reset. Emilio's annual tick control cost $0. His neighbor Blake's cost last year after stopping pour-on $0. 2 ranches, 160 cows combined, 0 chemical input. 31 Caracaras between the 2 properties doing the work that used to cost $3,000 per year combined. Linda told Emilio last month, your grandfather would be proud. Emilio was on the porch, same coffee, same sky that Augustine used to watch for birds. He's not proud, Emilio said. He's just not surprised. He knew the birds would come back. He told me when I was 12, remember the birds. That's all he said. He looked at the pasture. A Caracara was sitting on Augustine the bull's back. The bull was standing still. The bird was picking. The system was running. The land has a doctor for every disease. You just have to stop buying the medicine long enough to let him show up.